You ever have that one moment where you realize your family doesn't actually see you as family, but as a walking, talking ATM? Yeah, that's where my story begins. Hi, Reddit. I'm Emily. I'm 29, a nurse living in Ohio, and until a few months ago, I thought helping my family was just what good daughters do. Spoiler alert, good daughters get eaten alive by guilt trips, emotional blackmail, and we're a family speeches that sound less like love and more like threats dressed up as sentimentality. My parents, Linda and Carl, are 56 and 58. They've spent most of their adult lives mastering the art of doing absolutely nothing while convincing everyone around them they're victims of circumstance. My dad was a construction worker. Well, was being generous. He bounced from job to job, always quitting because, as he'd say, the boss was an idiot who didn't respect real talent. My mom was no better. She'd work retail for a few months, start complaining about stress, and somehow always end up on medical leave right when rent was due. They weren't lazy in the physical sense, they just worked extremely hard at avoiding responsibility. Then there are my brothers. Derek, 33, the golden child, the kind of man who could charm his way into someone's wallet before they even realized what happened. He's the dreamer, according to my mother, because he has potential. Translation, he has mastered manipulation. Then there's Josh, 25, the baby. Sweet enough on the surface, but his innocence is selective. He just needs time to figure things out, according to my dad. Though somehow that figuring out process involves sleeping till noon and playing video games in my parents' basement. And then there's me, the dependable one, the nurse with the steady income and the good head on her shoulders. The responsible one who everyone calls when the lights go out, or when Derek's business venture fails, or when Josh's car suddenly dies because he forgot to change the oil for 3 years. It started small, as it always does. Derek would call and say, can you spot me 50 until Friday? I've got a gig lined up and I'll pay you back right after. I'd send it, even though I knew that gig was code for sitting in a bar pretending to network. Then Mom started in with her soft-voiced manipulation. She'd call me after work and say, "It's so nice that you're successful, honey. We're so proud of you. Oh, by the way, the electric bill came in a little high this month and your father's been so stressed. Could you help out a little?" That little turned into me covering their electric, their internet, then their rent just this once, and eventually their car repairs. I started noticing a pattern. Every time I said no, someone would get sick, lose something, or have a dramatic breakdown about how hard life is when no one cares anymore. It was like emotional clockwork. Derek's new tires, my problem, Josh's speeding ticket, my problem, my mom's sudden need for therapy that suspiciously required cash. Guess who they called? But the breaking point came one Sunday. I had just finished a brutal 14-hour hospital shift. I was running on caffeine and sheer survival instinct. I stopped by my parents' place for dinner because Mom had been insisting all week that she made something special. When I walked in, everyone was already seated around the dining table. The air felt thick, like something bad was about to happen. Mom looked at me with this tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Emily, we've been talking. We think it would make sense if you helped us out more, like on a schedule." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Dad leaned back in his chair and said, "It's not like we're asking for much. It's just fair, sweetheart. You're the only one doing well right now, and family takes care of family." Then Derek slid a piece of paper across the table. It was an actual handwritten budget plan. It listed rent, utilities, groceries, even leisure expenses. The bottom of the list had a neat little total, $400 per week. I looked up, thinking surely this was a prank, but their faces were dead serious. Mom nodded and said, "You have to give us money for a week. We are a family." I could feel my pulse in my ears. I said, "You're not little children. You're adults. It's not my problem." The room went silent. My mom's expression twisted like she'd bitten into something sour. My dad muttered, "This is what happens when kids forget who raised them." Derek's jaw clenched and he said, "You're selfish. You make good money, but you can't even share with your own blood." Josh didn't say anything. He just stared at his plate like the mashed potatoes were going to save him from picking a side. I left. I didn't yell, didn't argue. I just walked out. I sat in my car, shaking, half from anger, half from disbelief. They just tried to turn me into their personal ATM, and when I refused, I became the villain. A few days later, I noticed they had all blocked me from the family group chat. I figured fine, peace and quiet for once. But then my aunt called me out of the blue. Her tone was sharp, accusing. She said, "Emily, what's going on? Your parents told me you abandoned them. They said they had nothing to eat." I almost laughed, except it wasn't funny. It was pure theater. My family had actually gone around telling everyone I'd left them destitute, that the nurse with a heart of gold, had suddenly turned cold and heartless. That was the moment something in me clicked. They wanted to play victim? Fine. They wanted to play games? Even better. Because if they wanted to play games, I'd bring the board. 2 weeks went by after I told my family I wasn't going to bankroll their lives anymore, and for the first time in years, I actually slept well. No midnight calls about emergencies, no random Venmo requests with cryptic notes like "you'll understand later," no emotional voicemails from my mother layered with sniffles and passive-aggressive sighs. Just peace. I thought that maybe, just maybe, they had finally accepted that I wasn't going to play their game anymore. Turns out I'd underestimated how creative they could get when cornered. It was a Sunday morning when my phone rang and I saw Mom flashing on the screen. I almost ignored it, but something told me to answer. Her voice came through the line thick with tears. She said, "We're in trouble. We're being evicted." The crying was dramatic, like a soap opera scene. I could practically hear her rehearsed pauses. I didn't react right away because I had a suspicion this was just another performance. She said the landlord was throwing them out unfairly, that they had nowhere to go, and that she couldn't believe her own daughter would let her parents become homeless. After we hung up, I called the landlord myself. I'd met her once when I helped my parents pay their rent months earlier, and she was a straightforward woman who didn't mince words. When she picked up, I introduced myself and asked if what my mom said was true. The landlord sighed the kind of sigh that said she'd been through this circus too many times. She told me my parents were 3 months behind, that they kept promising payment that never came, and that she'd been giving them chance after chance. She wasn't throwing them out suddenly, she'd just run out of patience. I realized right then that my mother's "we're being evicted" call wasn't a cry for help. It was a fishing expedition. She wanted me to panic, open my wallet, and fix everything again. But this time, I decided to approach it differently. I called her back and told her in my calmest voice, "Let me help. Meet me at your place tomorrow. I'll bring someone with me." She immediately brightened up. I could practically hear the smug relief in her voice. She thought she'd won. The next day, I pulled up to their apartment complex with my friend Carla. Carla is one of those people who can walk into a room and instantly take control of it without raising her voice. She's been working in social services for years and has dealt with every kind of case, from actual homelessness to families like mine who pretend they're in crisis to avoid accountability. I told her everything in advance, and she agreed to come as my housing caseworker. When we knocked on the door, Mom opened it looking disheveled but suspiciously made up. Her eyes were puffy like she'd been crying earlier, though I had a feeling most of that was self-inflicted dramatics. Dad was on the couch pretending to look defeated, flipping through TV channels like someone waiting for his cue in a bad play. Derek was there too, sitting at the table with that smirk he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. Josh wasn't around, probably too embarrassed or too cowardly to show up. I introduced Carla with a professional tone, saying, "Mom, this is Carla. She's a housing caseworker who's here to go over your situation." Mom's face went pale. It was the kind of panic you can't fake. She stammered something about how that wasn't necessary, that she just needed a little help to get back on track. But Carla was already in full work mode. She pulled out her clipboard and started asking questions in that calm, methodical voice that could slice through excuses like a scalpel. She asked how long they'd been unemployed. She asked about any history of substance use, gambling, or unpaid debts. She even asked if they'd ever attended any financial management classes. The transformation in the room was instant. My dad's face turned red, his jaw tightening as he muttered something about this being ridiculous. Derek looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Mom tried to interrupt, insisting that this wasn't what she needed, that what she really needed was temporary support. Carla didn't budge. She said, "We offer a number of community programs for people struggling financially, but they all require accountability. We start with an assessment, then move toward budgeting and employment planning." My dad stood up abruptly, grabbed his keys, and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard that one of the picture frames rattled off the wall. Carla didn't even flinch. She continued calmly, handed my mom a neatly folded flyer, and explained that it contained information about adult financial literacy classes, housing assistance applications, and employment programs. My mom didn't even look at it. She just sat there, clutching a tissue, staring at me like I'd betrayed her in the worst possible way. When Carla stood to leave, she gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "You did the right thing." After she walked out, I turned to my mom and told her, "If you're serious about changing, this is where it starts." My mother didn't take the flyer. She let it sit there on the table, untouched, like it was poisoned. I left without another word. There was no point. They didn't want help. They wanted handouts. They didn't want solutions. They wanted control. And since I wasn't giving them that anymore, I knew they'd come at me from another angle soon enough. Sure enough, the next day my phone buzzed with a text from Derek. It was short and venomous. "You think you're better than us? Huh?" I looked at the message for a long time before replying. I wrote back, "No, Derek, I'm just tired of being worse off because of you." A few weeks after the housing caseworker intervention, life started to feel like I was finally taking control. The quiet mornings and uninterrupted sleep were glorious, but I knew it wouldn't last. My family had always been creative in their chaos, and this time it was going to be a little more technical. I remembered something that had been gnawing at me for years. When I was younger, they had used my name to co-sign for utilities across the house. I had trusted them, thinking it was temporary, that they would switch it over to their names eventually. I assumed they would take care of it. I was wrong. It had been years, and those accounts were still tied to me. Every time I glanced at a bank statement or a credit alert, a little part of me recoiled at the thought that they could ruin my credit at any moment if they wanted. I decided it was time to clean house, literally. I spent an entire Saturday on the phone with every utility company connected to my name: electric, water, internet, cable, even the gas. Each call involved explaining that I was no longer responsible for the accounts, that my family was now living independently, and that I would not be held liable for any future payments. Some customer service reps were sympathetic, some were skeptical, but by the end of the day, all accounts had been transferred or removed from my name. There was a weight lifted, the sense of finally erasing their ability to drag me down financially. Then, an idea struck me. Derek had always relied on the family umbrella. I discovered that his car insurance policy was still registered under my name. That meant any lapse in payment could potentially come back to me. I called the insurance company, explained the situation, and had myself removed from the policy. This was a bigger move than I realized. I didn't just cut ties, I effectively severed his financial safety net. It didn't take long for him to notice. A few days later, his car was towed for expired tags. He sent me a text in all caps that felt like a fire alarm. "WTF, Emily, they took my car." I read it and smiled. I typed back calmly, as if I were narrating a documentary instead of watching my brother flail in panic. I wrote, "Guess you'll have to walk to your job interview." Oh, wait. The chaos didn't stop with Derek. That same week, my mom called me again. This time it wasn't about money. She was crying on the line, but it wasn't tears of financial desperation. It was humiliation. The eviction notice from the landlord had been posted publicly on the apartment door, and apparently the neighbors had noticed. She rambled about how everyone in the building now knew what a failure her family was, how embarrassed she was, and how she couldn't believe I had allowed this to happen. I listened quietly. The anger bubbling up in me had shifted into a calm, cold clarity. I reminded her, gently but firmly, that this wasn't my doing. that every bit of embarrassment she felt was entirely self-inflicted, the result of years of deceit, manipulation, and refusal to take responsibility. That while I had walked away from enabling them, they had chosen to live in a bubble of denial and expect me to clean up the aftermath. The line went quiet for a few seconds. Heavy with the realization that I wasn't going to rescue them anymore, she said, "You humiliated us?" I said, "No, Mom. You did that to yourselves." The last few weeks had been surreal, the kind of calm that feels almost foreign after years of chaos. Life without constant manipulation and financial demands was like stepping into a different world, one where I could finally breathe. But the universe, as it often does when you've been too accommodating for too long, decided to drop a bomb in the form of a quiet message from Josh, the youngest, the one who had always hovered on the sidelines of the family drama. His text was short, almost clinical, but the weight of it hit me like a brick. Dad had been caught trying to open a fake line of credit under my name. The police had been called. I froze for a second, heart hammering before I checked my credit. Clean, perfect, untouched. That small relief was like sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. But Dad, the man who had spent decades pretending the rules didn't apply to him, was now facing actual consequences, fraud charges, real consequences. Derek, of course, was not to be outdone in family idiocy. He had made it all the way to Arizona, attempting to cash fake checks under a new alias. Apparently, under the delusion that reinventing himself would erase the trail of chaos he left behind. I smirked while reading the details Josh sent, imagining Derek in a tacky motel, sweating over a stack of fraudulent paperwork that was about as secure as a paper umbrella in a hurricane. And then there was Mom. She had finally left Dad. She packed a few things, drove up to my one-bedroom apartment, and moved in. It was a tight fit. My small apartment was suddenly cluttered with her belongings, but it wasn't the clutter that mattered. It was the peace. For the first time in years, she had a place where no one was exploiting her, no one was yelling, and no one was pretending to be helpless to manipulate her into guilt-driven payments. She was sleeping on the couch, brewing coffee every morning without the underlying tension that had defined our interactions for decades. Her smile was slow at first, cautious, but it was genuine. One night, as we were sitting on the couch together, the soft hum of my refrigerator the only sound in the apartment, I asked her if Dad had ever apologized for anything. She shook her head, and the corners of her mouth twitched into a sardonic smile. She said that no, he had not. But with fraud charges looming, bankruptcy hanging over Derek, and his own financial life in shambles, Dad would have plenty of time to think about it. That realization hit me harder than anything he ever said to guilt me. Years of emotional extortion, financial threats, and manipulation had come crashing down, leaving him with nothing but consequences to stare at. Now the apartment was quiet in a way that felt alive. There were no guilt trips disguised as concern, no last-minute family emergencies, no frantic calls from Derek claiming he needed money or else. Silence had become a balm. I moved through my days with a sense of ownership that I hadn't felt since I first started nursing. Steady, calm, unthreatened, even small routines like making coffee in the morning or walking home from work felt restorative instead of transactional. And here's the thing about revenge. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be dramatic or malicious. In my case, revenge wasn't about catching Dad in a fraud scheme or watching Derek scramble to Arizona like a cartoon villain. Revenge was taking my life back. It was ending the cycle of abuse, manipulation, and financial exploitation. It was about reclaiming peace, and that peace had a sound. Quiet, steady, affirming. When Mom moved in, I hung a little sign in the kitchen. It was tongue-in-cheek, funny in its honesty. "We are a family, but this ATM is closed." She laughed the first real laugh I had heard in years, a laugh that filled the tiny apartment with warmth and a sense of possibility. That laugh was my real victory, more powerful than any confrontation or punishment. It was the sound of freedom, the confirmation that we could live on our own terms. Life had settled into a new rhythm. The phone no longer vibrated with requests or complaints. Derek was out of reach and out of options. Dad was facing justice, and Mom and I were finally able to build a relationship without interference, manipulation, or financial coercion. I could finally take my hard earned money and spend it on myself, my needs, and my future. The small apartment, the couch, the morning coffee, and the sign on the kitchen wall had become symbols of a life reclaimed. In the end, the story wasn't about payback, it was about boundaries, accountability, and realizing that love does not obligate you to finance someone else's failures. I had survived years of emotional mugging by family and emerged unscathed, stronger, and more independent than ever. The chaos of my past had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that whatever came next, I could handle it. Peace, stability, and genuine laughter were mine. And for the first time in a long time, the word family felt like it belonged to us, not to their expectations, manipulations, or entitlement. The ATM was closed, the chaos had ended, and life was finally mine.